Today we will be talking about the horrors of Dugsi, the things that go on in Islamic schools around the world, but particularly with Dugsi, and a lot of it can be extrapolated to Islamic schools throughout the world. Dugsi is a Somali word. It means school. It is usually a place of education. Dugsi is also used in Somalia for non religious education. They would say Duksiga Sare, Duksiga Hose, which would mean like elementary school versus high school. But generally, when we talk about Duksi, we are talking about a place where children are taught about Islam. It's an Islamic school where they receive religious education, spiritual guidance, and that's the idea behind Duksi. And over time, a lot of diaspora Somalis have been talking about the things that have been going on in Duksi, whether it's in Western Duksis or Duksis in Africa, parts of the Middle East, which are also called madrasas. Same thing. And so today we're going to talk about the dark side of this. Welcome, Wolf. Glad to have you here. Welcome to
أهلا أنت كيفك؟
Khair, Khair. How do you say welcome in marhaba? Is that marhaba?
مرحبا, yeah, it's basically welcome. أهلا can also be used for welcome and like that, or hi. It's basically like that. Hi, or how are you doing?
Okay.
أهلا is more like hi and like that. Marhaba is like how are you doing and like that. But yeah.
Perfect. Welcome. I think that you would also be a really good person to add on to what we're talking about today. We're talking about Duksi, and in the Arab world, I think you guys call it Madrasa, which is where they teach Islam, make kids memorize the Quran. And for
Yeah,
one,
madrasa, school, yeah.
yep, we're talking about it specifically from the religious perspective and a lot of the dark side. I think that madrasas are probably less violent than the Duksis are.
But you're talking about a Quranic school, basically, I'm
Right,
assuming, like an
Islamic
Islamic
school.
school.
Correct.
And you are right about them being very harsh. I know, like, I saw one guy, he gave a testimony when he became a Christian, he talked about it. And one guy on here, he's not a Christian, but he's an ex-Shia Muslim from Iran. I was one time talking about, you've probably heard the Syrio-Aramaic in the Quran. I brought it up to you before. When I
Yes.
was just reading some of it in Arabic and like that, he said he hates hearing the Quran. It terrifies him because he grew up having to read it in Iran, and they'll beat you if you don't recite it correctly. He's a grown man, older than me, and he's terrified of that book. He never wanted to hear it again. He never wants to hear it again.
And especially because it happens at such a young age, very young children, some as early as 5 years old, that they start with the beatings. I know in Somali Duksis, they don't really discriminate based on age. So basically, the setup for a Duksi is that the students attend for Islamic teachings. Most of the time, they're required to memorize the Quran. The caveat to this is that most Muslims do not speak Arabic. They do not know how to speak Arabic, but they are
They
forced
don't,
to.
you're right. And you want to know how actually usually I'm able to tell? I found out from the way how most of them recite the Quran. Which of them actually read it, but which of them actually recite it through like that singing they do. They call it tajweed. They
Yeah,
memorize the Quran through tajweed and like that. How do they recite it? Do they speak or are they singing it? That's
right.
how I was able to easily find out. In Indonesia, especially, say I were to go to Indonesia and talked in Arabic the way I just did to you a moment ago, just a few words, they're gonna think I'm praying or something. That I heard this from people from Indonesia. They'll just say
Just
Anun.
want to welcome our noon, one of the
Hey,
best
hey everyone.
ex-Muslims who absolutely so well educated on this topic.
Oh,
Yeah,
thank you.
welcome
Thank
back.
you. It's a
So,
great one. Thank you. What was I going to say? Yeah, this is a really great topic. So, yeah, take it away, Nita.
yes. So we were just doing some simple introductions, and Duksi and Madrasa kind of being the same thing, where they teach children about Islam, which, for lack of a better word, it's indoctrination, and a lot of what goes on in these schools. And so the setup is usually children go there to memorize the Quran. As I was just saying to the wolf, that most Muslims do not speak Arabic. And the fact that children as young as 5 years old are forced to memorize this in a foreign language that they haven't even grasped their own language, and now they're being forced to memorize this in a different language. They, in rural areas, usually they come into the Dugsi. Most of them are sitting on the floor. It's not comfortable. It's very crowded. All of the children in the neighborhood are brought there. The teacher could be male or female. They will have a stick or some kind of thing to beat the children with. And the children will be assigned readings to memorize. It's not even a reading, it's just the teacher will recite it. The children will regurgitate what the recitation that they just heard. They will be told to memorize what the teacher just spoke. And the next time that they come to class, they're supposed to say that without any mistakes. And if they do make mistakes, and sometimes they don't even have to make mistakes, we're going to go into a little bit of the different things that could trigger the teacher to beat the child. But let's just say in this example that the child makes a mistake in the recitation, that would give the teacher the option to beat the child. Now, in the Somali Duksis, what happens is this thing called washamsi. And washamsi is, so in Somali we say washamsi, but it's Surat al-Shams. And throughout the various ayahs, it's basically used to beat the child. So the child who is basically, if they're acting up in class, or if they're not memorizing correctly, they will be sat in the middle of the class. They will be blindfolded. Sometimes their hands will be bound, and then the other children in the class will basically form a circle around that child, and they would beat that child while reciting that surah. And so each child is told whatever you can hit him with or hit her with. It could be a stick, it could be a shoe. You can punch, kick, smack, pinch, scratch, whatever. And it's also a they're making an example out of that child, right? If you make mistakes in your recitation, if you trigger the teacher for whatever reason, this is how you're going to be treated. You are going to be beaten. Inactive says, does this happen in Western countries or back home? This is what I've known that happens in Somalia and neighboring countries where Somalis live. So Djibouti, Kenya, Ethiopia. But I would
But
assume
it definitely happens abroad. It definitely happens. I was beat our Duxi. Some people like Nabat, for example, he went to Duxi in Europe and he was fine. Like he like his Duxi, it wasn't like the situation. I think it was just the individual, maybe his particular class. He said that his teacher didn't beat him. But let me tell you, let me assure you, in Australia, we definitely got was Shamsid and it was relentless. The beatings were horrific. And yeah, I think it's pretty widespread. I'm pretty sure in the UK, like I've heard from others in the UK, in the US as well too, it does happen. So it's just not something that is exclusive. You got to remember that people don't change because they come to the Western world, and Muslims anyways definitely do not evolve. If anything, they have a reaction where like they want to double down on their beliefs and practices. So yeah, I guess this is a global phenomenon. It's not just exclusive to people back home. I think the only difference I would say with the Duksis back home is obviously the state of the buildings and stuff like that are probably more dilapidated and so on, but the practices themselves are exactly identical.
right.
I'd like to actually add something. You mentioned beating them with rulers and sticks. One of the people I heard about the beatings from when learning to recite the Quran, the teacher didn't have a ruler or a stick. That teacher had a whip that he would hit them with. That's what I knew of. I knew of a whip. I didn't know about them using rulers or sticks. I knew about them
Right.
using whips.
Our ma'alin, our teacher, would literally bring new and like more harmful, I don't know, a stick and beating with a ruler honestly would have been somewhat a luxury. We would beat with like leather straps with like metal attached to it. You would be seriously injured. And I'd often see it was definitely a motivating factor for me to memorize the Quran. It wasn't that I loved the Quran or anything, but I was just so afraid, deathly afraid of the horrific beatings that you would get. And I'd seen it. And exactly, and I'll let Inna continue with the concept of Washamsi because it's not just physical, but physical abuse. That's the other thing. There's verbal, there's public humiliation, there's all of that. And that's what she's talking about with being Washamsi. But yeah.
And I did want to add, I A lot of these things that I'm with Shamsi, I haven't personally experienced it, but my siblings who, when we went to Africa, this happened to my siblings. And when they told me about what Shamsi, when we were in the US, we went to a madrasa. So it was controlled and ran by Arabs. And so it wasn't a Muslim Dugsi, but they would still use other ways of punishing you, just not physical. There was, the forced memorization, the emotional abuse. So they use different forms, and I think maybe because they were, I don't know why in this specific school they didn't, but I know, just like Noon's saying, within, even within the U.S. there are Duksis that still beat. I think it just maybe difference going from school to school and who runs it. But this was Shamsi actually happened to my brother. And this is another part of the Duksi, because the Duksi is also used as community policing. So my mom, when she would get angry with one of my brothers, she would be like, when you get to Duksi, you're going to get it. And she would tell the ma'alin at the Duksi that, oh, so and so was acting up today, beat them when they get there. And so when they would arrive, the teacher would basically be like, okay, before we start today's class, we're going to have a washamsi because one of the students was acting up. And basically, they would blindfold him and the whole class of students. It could be about 30, 40 of them. And they would all beat that child. And they're not discriminating between girl and boy, right? In this specific case, it happened to my brother. But they've told me about instances where this happened to girls as well, and they would hit that child and they'd make an example of that child, that it doesn't matter where you are, right? You could be at the store and a hadir, like an aunt from the community, could see you playing ball, and if she doesn't like the way you're behaving, she's going to tell your duksi ma'alin, and your ma'alin is going to beat you. If you're acting up at home, and this can be, again, they don't, there's no hard and fast rules. It's just at their own discretion of, if they're feeling some type of way today, then they could report that child to the teacher to get basically disciplined. So it's a way of community disciplining, policing. So that's why a lot of Muslims have an eye on each other, because they understand they have many different mechanisms of policing each other and disciplining and controlling each other. And the Duksi is one of those areas. And for many children who are attending Duksi, their days are filled with apprehension and dread, right? You don't know if you're going to go to that Duksi today, and you missed sleep the night before and you didn't memorize it perfectly. And this is memorization, right? Like, you have to be sharp. You could forget your ayahs. You could make a mistake on the vowels. Obviously, you don't speak the language, right? So you're just going by it, off of it by ear. And especially when they're very young and they can't even read, it's so they're going into these classes with dread and apprehension and fear, and that fear can stick around with them for days, and it can stick around with them till they get home and then back to Duxi.
I just wanted to interject here quickly, and because I just want to piggyback off what you said, because it's just so profound to me. Basically, it literally cripples you, especially in the Western world. I did not, like, I would choose to do my Duxi memorization over my, my Western normal English homework or math homework, arithmetic or whatever, because just because I was so deathly afraid of those beatings. And that's what happens with a lot of Muslim children that are going to madrasas and so on. They choose to focus on their Duksi homework, their memorization over, because they know they're going to get beaten up. And actually, a lot of people, and it's funny to me, like that they've either born or grew up in the West, but for whatever reason, now as adults, they really don't have a very strong grasp of the English language. And I believe it's because when they were young, they were forced to go to Duxi and they prioritized learning the Quran over education. And yeah, the choice is very simple when it comes down to when there's physical violence being threatened to you. So yeah, I know definitely that was certainly a problem for me.
The Wolf, did you want to add something?
Actually, I did have one question. Because of the beatings and like that, have they ever been bad enough that they've resulted in deaths? Have children ever died from these beatings? That's what I want to know, actually.
Not that I've witnessed personally, not in the Western world, because what they do with the beatings, they're very meticulous. They will beat you in such a way where it really is excruciating, but it's not to the point where, for example, authorities could reprimand them for it. But yeah, sure, it does definitely happen in the Eastern world. But yeah, go ahead and tell.
Yeah, that's what I thought. I was wondering more in the Eastern world. I can't even believe this would even be allowed in the West. They beating children like that, they haven't had that. Even in the Middle East now, like Syria, where my family's from, hitting a child with a ruler is no longer allowed.